Hello, welcome to Social Studies Online. My name is Eden Cho, and I'm a museum educator at the National Museum of American History. We're so grateful you're able to join us, whether that's live or an archived version. If you're joining us live, remember that you are able to ask us any questions you may have during our time here by commenting in the chat box. We just ask that you keep your private information private. We hope you enjoy, and I'm now going to turn over the introductions to our host, Orlando Serrano.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Like Eden said, thank you for being with us today. If you're joining us live or later on, if you're watching an archived version of this, and as we wait for our wonderful platform of Learning Lab to transition our talk here, I'm going to introduce our guest who's with us today. Amy Tamarantz is with us, and she's part of the staff over at the National Museum of the American Indian. My name is Orlando Serrano. I'm the manager for youth and teacher programs at the National Museum of American History. So Amy, before we get started and we talk about some of the cultural resources you brought to share with us today, can you let us know a little bit about your work over at NMAI? What are some of the things that you do on a day-to-day basis?
Thanks, Eden and Orlando, for inviting me to be a part of this program today. I'm Amy Tamarantz, and I'm the lead cultural interpreter at the National Museum of the American Indian at our Washington, D.C. location. And so as a lead cultural interpreter, I get to design and help deliver educational programming, primarily for middle and high school students, but we also serve lifelong learners as well. And I also get to mentor and train staff who deliver those programs on a daily basis.
Wonderful. Now, I want to point out for folks who maybe are unfamiliar, you mentioned that you're at the Washington, D.C. location. If we infer, that means there's another location. Could you share a little bit about that and let folks know that we have more than one location for this particular branch of the museum?
Absolutely. Yeah, the National Museum of the American Indian is one museum with two exhibition spaces. So we have one exhibition space in Washington, D.C., where I normally get to work every day. And we have an exhibition space in New York City in Lower Manhattan. So each location has different exhibitions, but they all draw on the same collection, the same mission, and the same staff.
Wonderful. Thank you. And so what are some of the, experiences that brought you to the National Museum of the American Indian? What were you doing before you joined the staff there?
Yeah, I actually just celebrated my 9-year anniversary working for the Smithsonian last week.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It seems like it's been much longer than that some days, and others just like I joined yesterday. Before I joined staff at the Smithsonian, I had received my bachelor's degree in anthropology, and I had also done a master's degree in international development. So I had just wrapped up my master's degree when I got a job at the American Indian Museum, and I actually started out working in early childhood education, so with early learners, pre-K to third, and so I've moved up a little bit to start working with middle and high school students.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you, Amy, for the brief introduction to yourself and to your work that you do for Smithsonian, and let's get started. We're going to transition here to our first cultural resource, and first of all, we see that the title of it is Nations, a Morning Tribute. And before we get started, can you just give a brief overview of some of your thinking that went into selecting the resources that you brought to share today? What if you were to come up with like a headline for the resources that you brought together, what would it be?
That's a great question. I think that the resources that I've collected to share with everyone today, it's all about changing the narrative about American Indians in American society. And I think the object that we have displayed on the screen now, this what looks like an American flag, is a really great example of how at the Museum of the American Indian, we're changing this narrative. This object is actually one of my favorites, one of my most favorite objects in our collection, and it is actually on view right now at our DC museum. When you look at it at first, it looks like an ordinary American flag, but there's such a deeper story that's in here. This flag was designed by a Ute artist named Jenny Ann Chapoose Taylor, and she designed it in 2002 in response to the September 11th terrorist attacks. And if we look deeper at this object, we notice some differences. One of the biggest differences is that this flag is made entirely of tiny glass beads. Over 100,000 tiny glass beads are making up this flag. Upper in the left-hand corner where we would normally find the stars, we can see the state abbreviations, and they're actually listed in the order in which they became part of the US. Within the red and white stripes, you can actually see the names of over 400 different American Indian tribal nations that are within the United States. So this object, to me, it really shows how American history and American Indian history are really indivisible. In the month of November, which is traditionally Native American Heritage Month, it's often a time that educators and other learners want to learn more about American Indians. And in classrooms, this is often the time of year where history lessons, especially social studies, talk about American Indians and American history. But then American Indians kind of vanish from our history lessons once we move on from early America. And this object and our museum is really here to show that American Indians have always been a part of our history, and they continue to be a part of our present and future. And this object really helps to illustrate that this is an ongoing conversation. And it helps to challenge the narrative also about when we talk about American Indian objects. This is a contemporary art piece. It's not necessarily done it is done in traditional style, but it's done in a contemporary interpretation.
Yeah, and thank you, Amy, for the deeper context and the background information about the development of this particular object, or this piece of art. And it's really interesting the way in which, because of the use of glass, I can see that if you flash light on it in different ways, different words come up, right? So in the second rendering of the art, we can see the Pledge of Allegiance in the background behind the states, and we can more clearly see some of the tribal names in the red stripes, throughout the rest of the work. And so I have a few questions. One, do you know why the artist, or do we know why the artist chose to replace the stripes with the initials of the state names?
That's a really good question. I think overall, the choices that were made to kind of substitute different representations or include things that weren't there previously is to really show that American Indians are woven into the fabric of our country, and to show that even from the very beginning, when the United States was first forming, American Indians have and were a part of that process. So to show that the order in which the abbreviations come, where the stars were, in that order is just kind of reflecting of that kind of history. So normally those stars represent the states more abstractly, right, in a normal American flag, but this one's kind of going a step further and saying, what are those states and when did they come a part of the United States? And actually behind or around all of those abbreviations, in addition to having the Pledge of Allegiance, which is the first line, it includes other quotes from both native and non-native speakers.
Oh yeah, I can see this right here. Oglala Lakota. Yeah, and then and I have a couple more questions. One, I see that some of these have red dots in them. Are those to denote the original 13 colonies?
That's right.
Okay. And these are the dates in which the colonies were formed, correct?
Yes.
All right. Now, you mentioned that the artist, Jenny Ann Chapuz Taylor, the artist. Is there any other background information about her that you could share that, perhaps if folks are interested in some of the work that she has done, that they could look up?
That's a great question. I don't have too much more detail about Jenny's work, but I know that there's some artist page online that you can learn more about her pieces as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. And for folks who are out there joining us, I encourage you all to check out some of the other social studies online collections that we have. One in particular where we talked about how maps can, show change over time. Amy, this reminds me of a piece that's in Sam that has, thank you, Eden, for putting it up, that is similarly, right, making some of the points that you're making right now through the flag, that, you know, American Indian, Native American history is embedded in U.S. history, and we cannot take it out, right? In the same way that the flag had some of the sayings of Native American folks in it, the map here, you know, you can see the place names that stand out are oftentimes the Native American place names for the land we now call the United States. So it's a beautiful, beautiful work of art, the flag. Thank you for bringing that, and thank you, Eden, for finding the map as well. All right, we're gonna move on to our next cultural resource, and we can see that this is a brand new resource, actually, the National Native American Veterans Memorial that was just unveiled last week. Is that correct?
Yeah, last week on November 11th, Veterans Day.
All right, and what can we know about this? What can you share with us about this piece?
So this memorial to Native American military members and service, as we mentioned, just opened last week, and it's right outside the main entrance to our museum. So you can see the museum just in the background there. And this is the first time that on a national scale that Native people's military service in every branch of the U.S. military have been recognized. We received charge from Congress to create this memorial on the grounds of our museum. And ever since we received that, we spent countless hours consulting with different Native communities across the United States to get their input on what they wanted this memorial to be. You can imagine, with nearly 600 federally recognized tribes within the United States, that, you know, there's no one single view about what this memorial should be. We had a design competition where we had over 100 submissions that we received, and a jury of Smithsonian representatives that selected the final design. And so what we see here is that in action. The artist who designed this, his name is Harvey Pratt. He himself is a veteran. He served in Vietnam, and he's from the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma.
This is beautiful. And, you know, can you share a little bit about the meaning of the shapes that are used, the materials, how you know, I notice when we zoom in here on the image that there are, you know, places to sit. Can you share a little bit about the design elements that Mr. Pratt brought to the fore?
Absolutely. There's a lot of symbolism that's built into the design of this memorial. First, the one thing that kind of grabbed your attention the most is this kind of circular ring right in the middle. But there's other circular references. The fact that the entire memorial is in a circle, the seating is circular, and in many Native cultures, circles have particular symbolism. For example, the circle of life, kind of the circles for dancing and circles for prayer. Within the center and the base of the flame there, of the circle, there should be a flame, which we light on special occasions. And incorporating that element of fire is really important because it symbolizes, for many communities, strength and endurance, and also kind of comfort. We were just talking about how it's a little cold today, right? You know, that warmth that fire brings. There's also around the base of the central circle a place for water, and so water signifying also purification and prayer. One of my favorite features of this memorial are the lances that emerge from the exterior circle. This is an opportunity for folks to tie prayer cloths, so pieces of cloth that you tie while kind of either saying out loud or thinking of a prayer that you're making. And as the wind blows those prayer cloths, it is meant to carry those messages up to the Creator and up to the heavens. So we see this memorial as a space for reflection, for both Native and non-Native people, to recognize the sacrifices that Native veterans have made in service of this country.
You know, as you explained and pointed out some of the symbolism there, I couldn't, you know, I sort of was mentally checking off the ways in which all, the four major elements have been brought in this really compact space, where we've got fire and water and earth with the beautiful stonework, and then lastly the landsets bringing out the wind. That's such a wonderful sacred design. Thank you, Amy, for the context. Folks, we are going to transition to our next cultural resource, but I do want to remind you all, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the chat, and we'll be happy to get to them. All right. Let's see here. We have an eagle feather headdress. All right, Amy, what do we have here? What can you tell us about the headdress in addition to what it's called?
Oftentimes, Orlando, when I ask students or even adults, when they think of images of American Indians, what comes to mind? And oftentimes they describe something that looks just like this. So this eagle feather headdress is a really well-recognized symbol of Native people. It's become synonymous with Native people in general, but it's also an object that is very misunderstood. This headdress that we're looking at right now, it comes from a tradition from tribes in the plains. This one in particular is from the Lakota Nation, but there are other tribes within the plains, like the Cheyenne, that wore headdresses that were styled just like this one. And traditionally within Lakota people, only men would wear headdresses like this one. Each of those feathers that we can see represents an honor that was earned. So you don't just say, I did something really good, I'm going to give myself a feather. The people in your community have to determine that what you did was worthy of receiving that. And only after you had received enough feathers could you then assemble and earn the right to wear a headdress like this one. The photograph that we see right now is of this headdress in the gallery in our Americans exhibition right now. And if I were standing next to it right now, I'm about 5'10", and this headdress is taller than I am. So one of the things that we can tell about this headdress and the person that wore it is that that person was very accomplished to earn the right to make and wear a headdress like this one.
Now, it's a couple of questions follow, and I want to make sure I understand, and for folks on, watching at home to understand. You mentioned early on that oftentimes when you ask, what do you think of when you think of Native Americans or American Indians, folks will imagine a headdress. Yet, from what I heard, these kinds of headdresses were very specific. They were not used broadly. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. There's only a small number of tribes in a specific region of the United States that have this as a tradition. Other tribes have different styled headdresses or don't wear headdresses at all. But also a main point of that is that each of those feathers is sacred. It's received from an act that was earned. So it's not just anybody has the right to wear a headdress like this.
And that led me to the other two questions that I have. One is, what are some of the actions that were deemed honorable enough to be given a feather, to earn a feather? What are some examples?
That's a great question. The criteria used to determine whether or not you would receive a feather has changed a little bit over time. Historically, it could be for an act of battle, a victory. It could also be for something that's called counting coup. It's when you can get close enough to an enemy to cause them harm, but you don't. It shows that you were able to, but you showed restraint not to. So that you were able to penetrate their defenses, you were able to get into that position, but you did not. So you could receive a feather for that. Today, some examples of acts that would earn you a feather continue to include military service. So after serving in the military or specific tours of duty, oftentimes service members or veterans will receive feathers in recognition of their service. Also, high school graduations, college graduations, other kind of academic achievements today are an opportunity for Native people to receive feathers from their community. So they have feathering ceremonies as part of or alongside of graduation ceremonies, for example.
Okay, we're going to come back to that in a second. The third question I have is in relation to the feathers themselves. You mentioned that one has to earn a certain amount of feathers before one can even start putting one together. Do you have any idea of what the minimum is to be able to start actually adorning a headdress to wear?
Kind of the minimum is if kind of from shoulder to shoulder, if you can assemble enough at that point, and then the rest kind of flow down the back. So this person who this belonged to has gone above and beyond the work that was needed to even start.
Absolutely. Okay. Now, the last, as we are going to transition to our next tile, I want to pick up on maybe something folks did not notice, but you were very clear that this is an ongoing current practice that, contrary to what maybe some popular beliefs are, Native American culture and American Indian culture continues to thrive and is alive today. And I'd like to use that thought to transition to our next tile to talk a little bit about Americans and the exhibit and some of the thinking behind how this was all put together. So we just learned about how sacred this headdress is, the importance of it, the significance of it, and yet we see headdresses here on cleansing powders, on radiator cement, on baking soda. Can you let us know and give us some background on the thinking of Americans, the exhibit, and how you all juxtapose these two objects together, everyday objects here versus cultural sacred resources that we just saw?
Absolutely. So the exhibition Americans that Orlando you mentioned is on view at our DC museum, and the objects that we see on the screen now actually form floor to ceiling the central part of our gallery. It contains over 300 images and objects, all showing how American Indian names, imagery, and even stories infuse really the American popular imagination. We wanted to use these everyday objects kind of as a starting point because they are what most Americans are familiar with and they see every day. So these everyday objects can serve as starting points for us to have bigger conversations about why is this representation here? Why does that matter? And why does it matter to our visitors, most of whom are not Native themselves?
Wonderful. And folks, we will be putting the information for other resources from the National Museum of American Indian in the comment section. It will be available in this learning lab that you can access later on. So please do make use of those resources. And Americans is a wonderful exhibit that, yeah, like you said, Amy, it's floor to ceiling with objects that should drive us to question, why is this headdress here? And then we can learn about the sacred nature of it later on. All right, we're going to transition to one more cultural resource, and we're going to do something a little bit different with this last one. But before we do, Eden, is there anything that you'd like to interject, anything that you've learned, or any questions that folks have had in the chat?
We do have a question from Caitlin. It is fairly long, covering half of our screen, so I'm just gonna shorten it a bit. Why are textbooks at public schools nationwide created by private companies rather than a rotating coalition of academics? Which textbooks do you approve of? And I know both of you have worked with young people, so are there any good books for teachers to read, but also for our young people to read?
Amy, do you want to take a crack at this first?
Yeah, absolutely. The museum actually did a textbook analysis, 2 of them, to see how American Indians were represented in kind of the largest social studies textbooks, or the most commonly used in our country. And we found that there were certain stories that always kept being told. And largely after 1900, American Indians disappeared from the conversation. And so our museum has launched a national education initiative called Native Knowledge 360, which provides kind of what the textbooks are missing. So it's these online resources that provide curriculum for teachers and students to use in the classroom. The museum, in addition, has also published a number of other books, not so much textbooks in that kind of realm, but other resources that include Native perspectives, in many cases written from first-person perspectives, that help to show different narratives, difference from the narratives that we're typically seeing in our nation's textbooks.
Yeah. Eden, thank you very much for putting the information for the Americans in the chat. If we'll also put information, like we said, for Native Knowledge 360 in the chat as well. Sort of just building off of that, on our website, History Explorer, we have recommendations for books that young people can access and read that are diverse and inclusive. And also, Becoming Us is, quite frankly, inspired by Native Knowledge 360 and includes some content, some curriculum, historical events, but also contemporary issues, because, like Amy said, oftentimes Native Americans have just dropped off after 1900, but Native American communities are with us today and are important to learn with and about. And so we've assembled some resources as well. Again, strongly inspired by the work of Native Knowledge 360. All right, our last cultural resource for the day.
Can I interject really quick about the headpiece? We have one more question from Carolina, sorry. How old was that headpiece?
That's a really good question. I think if we back up to the headpiece on this learning lab, you can learn more about the specific object that it comes from, or the card catalog. So up there's a link, and I believe it's from the 19th century. So you can dive deeper, learn more about who owned it, which specific Lakota group this belonged to. It's Sichangu. So that's a great resource to know, that many of the objects that we include in our learning labs allow you to dive deeper. So this one is telling us
1860. Yeah. So we got a time range. So yes, yep. You're correct, Amy. 19th century, 1863 to 1931.
Great question.
Yes, thank you, Carolina or Carolina, however we pronounce your name. We apologize. We got it wrong both times. Maybe there's a third way. We just don't know. All right, for our last cultural resource, we are going to use a thinking routine, a way to help make our thinking visible. And this one is called Step In, Step Out, and Step Back. And so, Amy, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions and ask you to respond, given that we know this is a frieze and it is of Pocahontas. And the first question is, given what you know and see at this time, what do you think the person might feel, believe, know, or experience? Where we understand that Pocahontas is the main subject of this particular frieze.
Yeah, some of the things that I'm kind of feeling. One is that this main character of Pocahontas in the center, scared and afraid, seeing that someone is in danger in front of her, the figure to the right who's kneeling, and feeling like she might be able to do something about that, but that she herself may get hurt. So when I look at her face, I'm seeing kind of some fear and apprehension involved in that, but also bravery. She's right there in the middle of things that she feels like this is the right thing to do. That's something I think that she believes as well, based on this painting, that she has the ability and the confidence to do something about the situation.
Now, if we step out a little bit, what else do you think you would like to learn or know to understand both this person's perspective, but this work as a whole?
Yeah, I'd like to know a little bit more about her connection to the other characters and figures in this particular frieze. I'd also like to know from whose point of view is this frieze being told? Is it from her point of view, or is it from someone else's? And why does that matter?
Amy, that's a wonderful and excellent point, right? We can see that the scene itself, Pocahontas is the subject, the main focal point. However, great question, whose perspective is being brought to bear on this scene? Who is writing this story, if you will? And why should that matter? So then if we step back a little bit, given your exploration and knowledge of Native American history, Pocahontas and her story, what do you notice about your own perspective and what it takes to learn and understand somebody else's perspective?
Certainly, empathy is a really powerful feeling to have. And I think I empathize with Pocahontas as the character in this particular frieze. One, because I've also felt those feelings of being scared and nervous and brave even, but also as a woman, I can empathize from that perspective as well.
Okay. Thank you, Amy, for stepping in, stepping out, and stepping back with us. And let's step back a little bit further. What information can you add to contextualize, again, the author, the person's perspective who created this particular scene?
Yeah, so the story that this frieze is telling us, and maybe, the common story we all know of Pocahontas, memorialized in a Disney film, is told from the point of view of the person that's kneeling in this image, and that's John Smith. John Smith wrote about his adventures no matter where he went, whether it was here in America or in North Africa, and he always on the brink of death, and a beautiful young woman just manages to come in and save his life at the right moment. So experts, even at the time that this was being told and today, believe that John Smith grossly exaggerated what happened to him. They doubt this scene ever happened at all. In his stories and in Disney, there's a romance that's suggested between Pocahontas and John Smith, but we know that around 1607, when this event was supposed to have happened, Smith was in his 30s and Pocahontas was between 9 and 11 years old. So, Orlando, there was no romance between those two people. But that makes for a great story, right? Yeah, this kind of, lovers at odds, Romeo and Juliet, kind of families at war with one another. It makes for a good story. But the real story, the hidden story, is so much more interesting.
Well, thank you, Amy. And, I appreciate the additional context that you added, because by bringing that into the conversation, knowing that anything that is created, produced around the narrative of the encounter between Pocahontas and John Smith is from the perspective of John Smith, recast this frieze altogether, right? Because when we first look at it without that information, we might think, all right, Pocahontas is the subject. This is from her perspective. But if we know that any information we have about these events are from John Smith's journals, his travel writings, then really this frieze is being told from his perspective. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. Pocahontas herself never wrote anything about this. In fact, she never wrote anything about her own life at all. Her story has always been told by other people.
Okay. Oh dear. All right. The always more interesting than at first glance. Well, folks, we have come to the end of our time together. I do want to give one last pass to see if there are any more questions or comments that are needed to be shared with everybody else who maybe isn't aware of the chat. Eden, anything to point out here?
Just one from a student. Were or are feather headdresses for leaders? Does a person become a leader for having the most feathers? And I am curious about that too. Were they exclusively for leaders, or was it just anyone who showed courage, people who earned those feathers?
That's a great question. It's really dependent upon the tribe and their particular traditions and ceremonies. An individual feather doesn't necessarily mean that that person was a leader in that community. They may have exhibited leadership qualities that earned them the right to own that feather. But the headdresses, kind of the collection and assembly of those feathers, does indicate that they have a leadership role within the community.
Okay.
And I want to squeeze in one last question because it's so important with Thanksgiving that's coming up next week. Amy, do you have any resources you'd like to suggest that give proper context to the history?
Absolutely. On our Native Knowledge 360 landing page, we have curated a whole collection of Thanksgiving resources, ranging from short videos to posters to informational handouts to full-on lessons where you can dive deeper into Native perspectives on Thanksgiving and also kind of what we did with Pocahontas, dive deeper into the story of Thanksgiving. I'll give you a clue. The real story is much more interesting than the story that we tell.
No, and if folks happen to be in the general Delaware, Maryland, DC area, I went for a bike ride on Route 1 in Virginia, and I just passed a route marker for, you know, where the kidnapping of Pocahontas may or may not have taken place, and it just stopped me dead in my tracks, you know, that this is all around us and definitely worth investigating. All right, here we have the different websites that you can go to. For more resources, please visit them. They are wonderful. Like I said, Becoming Us is greatly inspired by the work of our colleagues like Amy and the rest of our team at National Museum of American Indian. And I do want to remind you that the next time we will be speaking about, one more, the topic of universal human rights. And that's December 10th at 11 in the morning. I do want to shout out also one of the recommendations in the chat. The book by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz is a wonderful resource. Thank you for bringing it to the surface there, Eden. Please check that out. Thank you, everybody, for your time with us. Amy, thank you for sharing all of these wonderful cultural resources and stories with us today. Eden, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you so much for joining us. In the comment box is the Learning Lab collection link, as well as a wealth of information that we've talked about today. We hope you stay safe and healthy. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.